And I read Adrian Wojnarowski. Now, to me, he's the source for the NBA. Works for Yahoo Sports covering the NBA. He didn't like the possibility of this Phil Jackson, James Dolan marriage with the Knicks. This is before it happens. It's easy to say after the fact, but Adrian puts it out there saying, hey, here's the deal. Don't like it because I know how this is going to end. Adrian, kind enough to join us on short notice. How did you come to this conclusion, Adrian?
Well, Dan, thanks for having me. The fact that nothing ends well with James Dolan is the first clue that it won't end well with Phil. I'm not going out on much of a limb there. But I do think in how Dolan deals with, and this to me is more from Dolan's side of it. I understand why somebody would want to hire Phil. Phil deserves a chance. I mean, people with far fewer qualifications than Phil have been given teams to run in the NBA. I'm not arguing that, but I just think this fit and the things that are important to James Dolan, which at the top of that list is dealing with the media. That's more important to him than winning, than drafting free agents.
Wow.
That is an obsession of his. I just think there's a lot of things that are going to make this a very difficult partnership, in the short and if there is a long run.
Do you really believe Phil is interested in the Knicks?
Oh, I do. There's no question. I mean, because, listen, there's a lot of jobs Phil could have. He could have had Detroit last year. They brought him in as a quote-unquote consultant. Basically, he spent a week at their facility canvassing the place, seeing if he wanted the job while Joe Dumars was doing coaching interviews. Dan Gilbert in Cleveland has said he wants to get a championship-level GM, so I'm sure if, Phil had interest there, I'm sure, right? But Phil's not going to live in Detroit. He's not going to live in Cleveland. There's very few organizations for Phil that can, number one, pay him what he wants, which I believe would be upwards of $10 million in this job, and two, gives him a geography of New York or Los Angeles. He would have went to Seattle if they had gotten the Kings last year. That was very much that partnership was in play and in motion. So there's just a very few places that he could go. Obviously, he has a history in New York. So in that sense, New York has to be on a very short list, even if it's not an ideal setup for him with the ownership and the fact that the team's in such disarray, and you're probably a long way there from being a real contender.
If I talk to you in 6 months, who's more likely to be in New York, Carmelo Anthony or Phil Jackson?
Carmelo Anthony, because at the end of the day, I think New York can just pay Carmelo so much more than everybody else. But if Phil comes to New York, it'll be very interesting to see what Carmelo's future will be, and if Phil is willing to build around him, to reinvest in him. And Carmelo has been a favorite of Dolan, and I'm sure that's something that's being discussed between Jackson and Dolan about where they want to go with Carmelo Anthony. Phil may just want to blow this whole thing up, and are they willing to go all in with Phil and let a superstar walk, or do whatever they would do to, try to facilitate a sign and trade, whatever it would be, Carmelo, or maybe try to keep him at a lower number than that $129 million 5-year deal that he could get.
Who would be the coach for Phil Jackson?
Frank Isola at the Daily News brought up a great name, and I agree. Steve Kerr. Steve wants to coach. Steve and Phil have a close relationship. It would be very interesting to see with Phil. I just can't imagine him hiring a coach that he doesn't know or have a relationship with. And I don't know if Steve's ready to do it yet. I don't know how Steve feels about moving to New York. He's got a great life in Southern California. His kids are playing college sports out there. He enjoys TV, but Steve likes challenges too. So I could see that being that's a reasonable look. And I think Phil had interest in bringing Steve to Seattle in some role, whether that was as his GM or as his coach. I know Phil had interest in that if the Seattle thing had gone through. But I just don't see Phil Jackson doing like a conventional coaching search and interviewing people and hiring a guy that he just doesn't have history with. So in that sense, I think Steve is an intriguing name, and I think that's a pretty good educated guess.
Adrian Wojnarowski, Yahoo Sports NBA writer, joining us, Dan Patrick Show. Lakers situation with Mike D'Antoni. The future for D'Antoni is what?
Murky. I think it's going to be hard for him to keep that job.
Is that you're officially listed as murky?
Murky. Probable to murky. Yeah.
DNP murky. I get the feeling he's not back with the team next year.
Well, I think it's going to be very hard. Listen, I don't know who was going to win with this roster this year, and he got off to a great start early. Yeah. I mean, they were, opening night win over the Clippers, and, they got up and down, but it wasn't going to last. The West is too deep, but the win over Oklahoma the other day helped. At least those things give you, especially after they got, crushed by the Clippers last week and the embarrassment of that game. That's hard. No matter who you are, you can't exist long with the Lakers with those kinds of losses. And again, it's not necessarily fair. The team, they're not built to win anything. And Kobe coming back, and then the other thing of going out in free agency. If they really want to make a run at Carmelo, they really can't do it with Mike as coach. I mean, we know their history.
Yeah, exactly.
And if they really want to make a hard run at Carmelo, I don't know how Mike D'Antoni could be sitting in those meetings and selling him on something Carmelo already doesn't believe works.
But how ironic would this be that if D'Antoni would not be back next year and Phil Jackson would end up with the Knicks, when you could have had Phil Jackson, probably kept Dwight Howard, you would have – I mean, that was a big, big decision the Lakers made by saying to Phil, hey, thanks, but no thanks.
There's no question. And, people around Dwight will tell you the chances of him staying would have been much greater with Phil. He believed in Phil. Phil wanted to play through the post. Phil liked playing Pau Gasol and Dwight together, which Dwight actually really liked. But they didn't. They built around Steve Nash, and Jim Buss wanted a coach who was going to get the most out of Steve Nash, and they kind of doubled down on Nash, and near at 38, 39 years old, he couldn't do it anymore. The injuries, and Dwight walked out the door, and there's no question that's a decision that will set them back years. You just don't let Dwight Howard doesn't, whatever people thought about him in L.A. and whatever frustrations they had with him, when a guy like that walks out the door and you get nothing for him, it takes a long time to recover from that.
Great stuff. Keep stirring it up, Adrian.
Thank you, Dan.
All right, Adrian Wojnarowski.